Dante. What should be said of him cannot be said. By too great splendor is his name attended. To blame is easier than those who him offended, than reach the faintest glory round him shed. This man descended to the doom and dead, for our instruction, then to God ascended. Heaven opened wide to him its portals splendid, who from his countries closed against him fled. Ungrateful land to its own prejudice, nurse of his fortune, and this showeth well, that the most perfect most of grief shall see. Among 1,000 proofs let one suffice, that as his exile hath no parallel. Nearer walked the earth a greater man than he. The doom of beauty. Choice soul, in whom as in a glass we see, mirrored in thy pure form and delicate, what beauties heaven and nature can create, the paragon of all their works to be. Fair soul, in whom love, pity, piety have found a home, as from thy outward state we clearly read, and are so rare and great, that thy adorn none other like to thee. Love takes me captive, beauty binds my soul, pity and mercy with their gentle eyes waken my heart a hope that cannot cheat. What law, what destiny, what fell control, what cruelty or late or soon denies, that death should spare perfection so complete. We are going to take a trip through the Renaissance era to learn about one of the most famous artists, Michelangelo. He was considered one of the greatest artists who ever lived. He was born in a small town in Italy in 1475. He moved to Florence, Italy when he was a young boy. When Michelangelo was 12 years old, his father sent him to study with the most famous painter in the city. Many important artists lived in Florence during the Renaissance period. Michelangelo was a very important part of the Renaissance era. He was invited to live with Lorenzo de' Medici when he was a teenager. Lorenzo believed he was very talented. Michelangelo studied ancient civilization and art while living with him. 1496. Michelangelo moved to Rome. While living in Rome, he studied the city's paintings, sculptures, and buildings. At this time, he made one of his most famous sculptures, Pieta. He was only 23 years old. Several years later, he left Rome and returned to Florence in 1501. In 1504, he created one of his most famous statues, David. The statue of David is over 14 feet tall. It also was carved from one single piece of marble. The David statue is one of the most famous statues in art history. Thousands of people from around the world go to see the statue every single day. 1505, Pope Julius II asked him to come to Rome. The Pope wanted Michelangelo to build a tomb for him, which would include many statues. This project was stopped in 1506 because of the war. 1508, the Pope asked Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. He began painting scenes from the Bible across the ceiling. He painted over 400 figures. It took 4 years to finish. This project really affected Michelangelo. He wasn't happy to be spending so much time painting. He didn't like to paint. He believed God gave him a talent to sculpt. His work set a new standard for painting. Artists from all over the world would come to see his work. Here's a fun fact. More than 20 years later, he went back to the chapel to paint one more scene, and it took 5 years to finish. 1512. At this time, he began drawings for the tomb for the Pope. He began sculpting again. The original plans called for about 40 statues. By 1516, he had finished some of his finest pieces of work, including Moses, the rebellious slave. Many statues from the plans were left unfinished. He often left pieces unfinished. Sometimes he just didn't like them or he didn't want to use them. 1519, Michelangelo returned to Florence to begin to work as an architect. Some things that he helped design were a library and a chapel. In 1534, he returned to Rome once again to start designing a city square. Also, he designed some of the government buildings around the city square. 1546, Michelangelo began designing the dome of St. Peter's Church. The dome rises 435 feet above St. Peter's Square. Another fun fact for you. The dome of the U.S. Capitol building in Washington, D.C. was modeled after Michelangelo's dome. During his last couple years of his life, he started working on 2 more Pietas. He did not finish those. One of them is called Florentine Pieta. It was meant for his own tomb. The statue is of Michelangelo as an old man, hooded, helping to hold up Christ's body. 1564, Michelangelo died at the age of 89. I want to thank you for listening to my travel through the 1500s and the life of one of the most famous artists. I really enjoyed learning more about his life. I found it very interesting that he hated painting but created such a masterpiece. I wish to visit the Sistine Chapel one day in my life to witness the beautiful paintings he has created.
Every morning, when the gates open, thousands of visitors head straight to the Sistine Chapel. When the chapel was constructed, the walls were filled with monumental murals. But the ceiling was just decorated with a simple field of stars. 26 years later, Pope Julius II decided it needed a new paint job. When he gave the task to Michelangelo, he took a leap of faith, because the artist was not then a famous painter. How did a brilliant but inexperienced painter complete the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in such a short time? The largest figures on the ceiling are upwards of 13 feet tall. Michelangelo did not attempt to paint them freehand. Each figure started as a sketch, or cartoon, followed by a procedure that art experts like William Wallace refer to as pouncing.
Pouncing is the means of transferring the cartoon to the plaster. So the cartoon has actually been pricked with little tiny holes, and the charcoal dust in a bag is actually pounced or pounded onto the cartoon. Okay, we see the head beautifully pounced and the hand beautifully pounced.
But pouncing was a slow process. And Michelangelo was under pressure from an aging pope who wanted to see the ceiling completed before he died. So Michelangelo exchanged the charcoal for a blade, allowing him to quickly incise the lines of the sketch directly onto the plaster. So how did Michelangelo complete his masterpiece in just 4 years? Quite simply, genius.